Grab a seat. Thank you so much, Lena. It was great to hear that concept of a remix, which has been something which has captured my attention as a metaphor for the church for many years. I'm a bit crazy. I go into large amounts of research. I was so captured by the idea of remixes that I went back to the origins of how remixes started. And I literally read a book about reggae, which is where you could trace the beginnings of remixes back. That was that thick, like Lunatic, back to King Tubby, Lee Scratch Perry, going to New York, Kool Herc, Afrika Bambaataa, read the whole history, but I don't want to talk about that. So I'm glad Lena got into that. I actually want to talk about a different kind of remix. In the Imperial War Museum in London, there is various machinery of warfare, bombers, tanks, all of these things that countries produce to destroy the enemy. And when you're in a museum and you're looking at weapons of war, they can look incredibly impressive, powerful, shiny, they're restored. But in the Imperial War Museum in London, there is actually something which seems out of place, but is not really out of place in a museum around war. And it's a piece of machinery. It was placed there by the artist Jeremy Deller. And what it is, it's a car, or the remains of a car that was blown up in a car bomb in Baghdad on March the 5th, 2007. And Deller placed this in the War Museum because he wanted to show the other side of war. And you can walk around this chassis of this car. It's brown, it's rusted, everything's bent. And I remember walking around that car and seeing it and realizing that this is a different kind of remix. The origins of the word mix, which we get remix from, if you trace it back to the Old English, one of the origins of the word mix is actually confusion, a sense of out of placeness. And as I looked at that chassis, it spoke to something inside of me. You see, if you have the idea of a remix in a song, normally a remix is made by a producer who's given some original elements, as Lena pointed out. There could be a beat, it could be a sample, it could be a vocal hook, and that's then reworked by a producer. My friend would do remixes, and I remember watching him one day, and I was at his house, and he had it on the computer, and he's doing all the stuff and moving a mouse, and I realized that he was in total control as he is making this original song that a musician had sent to him. He's turning it into a remix, and it's really all about the clicks of a mouse. It's his individual artistic mastery over what he wants to take an input and create something new out of it. But the remix of that car chassis that had been blown up is a different kind of mixing, which is a mixing that is out of control. That was a car bomb which had a terrible, devastating effect. It was blown up in a book fair in Baghdad. A number of people were killed. And it's one of those moments where out of the blue, people's ordinary lives get turned upside down in tragedy in a moment. Increasingly, you find chassis in many of the world's war spots that have not been blown up by car bombs, that have actually been blown up by drones. And one of the things we're seeing in our day and age is that warfare is shifting to drone warfare. And you have these portable weapons platforms. One of the first most important ones was the Predator drone created by the US military. And these things just buzz in the air. And if you've ever heard one, it's not like a jet. A jet is frightening and loud. It shakes the ground. Like an F-18 flies over the top. You hear it. Drones are rather these little buzzing sounds in the air. They just keep going and they're annoying and they stay up there for hours and hours and hours. And then often somewhere someone presses a button, sometimes in another country, possibly even on the other side of the world. And the missile that the Predator drone carries is actually a former anti-tank missile called the Hellfire missile. And this weapons platform, someone makes this decision, and people living their ordinary lives, all of a sudden everything is turned upside down like that as this Hellfire missile hits a car or a house and unleashes hell on the earth. My experience of remix in the last few years has not been me in control, looking at the church, what I want to take from the past, what I want to take from orthodoxy, how do I remix that in this current day and age in our context. Rather, I've experienced, like I think many of you have, that second kind of remix where somewhere out of the sky, a button is almost pressed and a missile comes and you don't hear it. Maybe you heard the buzzing for a while. It was a problem that was just, it's up there, I'll leave that for a bit. And then out of nothing, all of a sudden you're dazed and confused. Everything is just where it shouldn't be. And you're just reeling and dazzling in pain, wondering, how on earth did this happen? Trudy shared earlier her story of finding out of the blue about her cancer diagnosis. That was one of those buzzing things. We had come out of COVID, which was a thoroughly disrupting experience. But to be honest, I would rather go through COVID again in Melbourne than what came just after it. We went through a period, like so many churches, of just conflict and turmoil. And I'm not going to go into all the details. This is not the place to explain that story. But some of the things I felt was betrayal. A sense that the people who you thought you're going to run with, who you thought you'd be in ministry in 10 years, you're not with them anymore. People you looked up to, who all of a sudden had let you down. A sense of isolation. A sense of like, hang on, this is not how I thought this story was going. And just a sense like your world got turned upside down, slander, paranoia, wondering what this all meant. Where was God? This is not how the playbook was meant to play out. And this just went on for some time, and it's so discouraging. You get into ministry, you do discipleship because you want to help people and you feel God's love for people and you want to show that. And all of a sudden you find yourself dazed and confused on your back, wondering where that missile came out of the sky from. This went on for months. You have to have incredible resilience, fortitude. It's really easy just to roll back into yourself, become like a turtle pulling back into its shell. And so we were in that stage when I went to London. I got to speak at the Royal Albert Hall at Alpha's Leadership Conference, and it was just such an incredible time. I mean, I love coming to things and meeting people at places like this, but for me, after 2 years of COVID in Melbourne, not seeing many of my friends, after this really difficult leadership conflict season, I finally was in London, city I love, meeting friends I hadn't seen for ages. I was just like a pig in mud. It was a fantastic time. Got to speak at the Royal Albert Hall, just this incredible building. It was just this moment. The Asbury outpouring had just happened. There was this sense of excitement in the air. Just after the leadership conference, I got to speak in the pulpit of one of my heroes, Martin Lloyd-Jones, at Westminster Chapel. He'd written a book called Revival, which had spoken to me, lit this fire for revival in my heart. And I was speaking in his pulpit for the John Stott, his Institute of Contemporary Leadership. It's like two of my heroes. I'm getting to stand in places where they preach. And I remember just being like, this is incredible. And I left Westminster Chapel. I was heading to the tube, and I'm walking, and literally this is my prayer, like, God, I think that season is over. I think I'm coming out of it. God, I'm just praying for a season of flourishing now. God, please, this is just let me into something new. I get to St. James Park tube station. I ring Trudy because I know it's like morning time in Melbourne. It's late night in London. And I ring her and she says, are you with anyone? I'm like, no, I'm at the tube. I'm by myself. She says, I need to tell you something. I have this cancer diagnosis. I couldn't believe it. Somewhere, someone seemingly had pressed the button on the Hellfire missile, and out of the sky, again, I was on my back, completely disorientated. I'm listening to her on the details. My train comes. I get on the tube. I'm talking to her, and then we go into the tunnel, and I lose connection. I think I did like 13 stations in the London Underground, going deeper and deeper physically, but also going deeper and deeper emotionally and spiritually, going, God, you are kidding me. You've let another one of these missiles hit me. I was thoroughly remixed. Not in a way I wanted to be. I wasn't in control. I was completely out of control. And the next period was exactly the opposite. It wasn't, wow, now's time to get back and speak again. It was caring for Trudy, caring for my family, and leading my church during a time where, man, you were hurting, and it was just incredibly difficult. Again, this was not how things were meant to play out. But what I began to see during that time was God began to do this kind of refining work. You see, another word for remixing is refining. And actually, what I began to realize is that through seasons of suffering, of dislocation, of disruption, God does a kind of work that he cannot do in the good times. There is this moment in the book of Exodus, chapter 33, which I know has meant something here, and I think it's a word in season for many people at this moment. This sense of not wanting to go forward without God's presence. But there's this interesting bit in the middle of it. And what's happened is Moses has been in the presence of God. Like literally he's meeting with God in the overlap of earth and heaven at the top of this mountain. And God is unveiling all of these things to him. He's literally getting the living imprints, the blueprints of how people should meet with God, this tabernacle. God's like opening the book. What a moment to be the human being at that point. He must have been absolutely pumped. Like this is the ultimate mountaintop experience, literally and figuratively. And he must have been just so excited coming down from the mountain, and he's about to tell the people, you're not gonna believe, I just met with God. I've been literally at the lip of heaven and earth. Guess what, guys? And he comes down the mountain, missile, boom. You're worshiping a golden calf. Like what on earth? Betrayal. I led you out of Egypt. We're partnering with God, and you've let me down now. You're literally doing what the Egyptians did. You've just seen the plagues come against Egypt for worshiping other gods. You've made your own flaming God here. What on earth are you doing, people? The betrayal, the hurt, the what am I doing here? This is unbelievable. He would have just been completely disorientated. And so in the middle of 33, there's this little interesting bit where it says, Moses was in the habit of making a tent of meeting outside the camp. Now, what God had revealed was that on the top of the mountain, that he wanted to live his presence at the center of the people in the tabernacle. He wanted to be the beating heart, his presence of the society of Israel and who they were going to be as set apart and different in the world. But sin had come in, the missile had hit, everything was upside down. So what do you do as a leader, as a disciple, when you've been hit by the missile? When you've been remixed and you're out of control? This passage gives us an insight. Moses built something just outside the camp. This is not the tabernacle, it's the tent of meeting. The words are used interchangeably, but biblical scholars think this is something that Moses sets up in the interim. And there's this interesting little bit. He goes out and everyone comes out of their tents and they watch him. And he goes to the edge of the camp and he worships. And he meets with God. And what he does is someone who's gone through the disappointment and disorientation of coming down from the mountain, seeing the people sinning, is that he creates a temporary arrangement, a kind of second space where he can dwell with the presence of God. It says some people would go there. And what he's doing is, he's doing a time-tested strategy that we see throughout the history of the church, is that he doesn't create a whole new church. He creates what Martin Luther called a little church within the church, where those who are hungry, those who have been remixed, those who have been refined, can go and meet with the presence of God. You're not trying to change the whole system. Rather, you're modeling something different out here. And people go. Does everyone go? No. But people go. Now, what I love at the end of that little just insight into this strategy is it says Moses is in there, and then when Moses leaves, Joshua, son of Nun, would linger in the presence of God. That's the next generation. That's the next person who's going to take the promised land. That's the one that God has been preparing in that space. If Moses hadn't made that temporary arrangement, Joshua would never have stayed in the presence and been shaped by God to be prepared to do the next thing. I've got 40 seconds. I'm just going to say this. I think many of us in this room have been hit by the Hellfire missile. I think many of us in this room have actually felt out of control. I think many of us in this room have sometimes felt hurt, betrayed, disorientated. But the response to that is actually to set up spaces where we pursue the presence of God. is not to change the whole place, but it's actually to create, maybe it's just a prayer closet for you. Maybe it's just a small group of people. Maybe it's just half your church, a third of your church, a quarter of your church. Maybe it's your neighbors, but to actually find a place where you seek the presence of God, let him change you, create a remnant. And when that remnant gets on fire, it begins to influence the whole system. People like the Israelites who would stand at the foot of their tents go, hang on, something different is over there. And what begins to happen is people who've been remixed, refined, start to gain not positional power, not charismatic power, not relational power, but spiritual authority and power. And that is utterly magnetic in our age. So if you're wondering what has happened in the last season, it's hurt, you're allowed to grieve. I remember laying on our couch. When Trudy went through chemo, I couldn't be in the same bed as her because she was toxic, and I just cried and I grieved. But at the same time, I felt God's presence, and I felt him reshaping me in a way I could not if I was in control. God has been reshaping people in this building. He's preparing a new thing. There is a promised land. Dwell in the presence as he prepares us for the promised land. It is there. Let us step into it. Amen.